Dr. Hugh Montgomery discusses the relationship between climate change and diabetes. Dr. Montgomery details how environmental factors of health affect diabetes and other chronic conditions, and why we should consider issues of environmental diabetes as a public health crisis. Tune in to find out what effects of climate change impact diabetes, chronic conditions at large, and what policy interventions are needed to address changing global environments.
Podcasting from Dallas, Texas, I am Shireen, and this is the Yumlish podcast. Yumlish is working to empower you to take charge of your health through diet and exercise and reduce the risk of chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. We hope to share a unique perspective and a culturally relevant approach to managing these chronic conditions with you each week.
Dr. Hugh Montgomery is a professor of intensive care medicine and director of the Center of Human Health and Performance at University College London. He co-leads the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. Welcome, Dr. Montgomery.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Dr. Montgomery, diving right in, how did you get involved in medicine and when did you become interested in environmental impacts on health?
Well, I started at medical school, I guess, in the early 1980s and graduated, I think, 1987. And I was following a fairly conventional clinical academic path. And that in the 1990s meant that I was doing research, which was mainly genetic, molecular biology and so forth. And so my involvement in the environmental side of things was somewhat accidental. In the late 90s, certainly in the United Kingdom, there was much talk about climate change, but there was also an awful lot of discussion in the press saying it wasn't real, it wasn't happening, maybe the world was getting colder. But when I was looking up the science papers of interest to me in the molecular biology world, in the big journals, Nature, Science, and so forth, there were often papers relating to climate change. And they looked very, very worrying to me. So there was a discrepancy between the press and the popular press, that is, and the scientific press. So I decided that the thing to do would be to spend a year or two trying to understand the science, trying to understand the implications and work out whether it was a problem or not. And if it wasn't, then I could ignore it. And if it was, as the science papers seem to be pointing, then I'd need to do something about it. And essentially, I suppose by the year 2000 or so, it was obvious that we were in terrible, terrible trouble and that this was a very, very real problem. So that's really when I started working on it in parallel with my other academic work.
And can you help us understand what are the environmental factors of health?
Well, of course, there are many. I mean, our bodies are pretty much entirely dependent for their health to the external, internal environment we expose them to. So that relates to the air we breathe, the food we eat, the drugs we consume, and so forth. In terms of global environment, the impacts, of course, are huge because we are part of an ecosystem. We like to think we're not. We've got this idea that we live in houses and cars and we buy food off supermarket shelves. But we are just animals in a very, very complicated ecosystem. And we also are dependent for our survival upon clean air, access to water, access to food, and the right thermal environment. We essentially came out of Africa. We're adapted to live in an African climate. We can't have that externally, so we make it with central heating and clothing or cooling and whatever. So if we exceed the planetary boundaries for air, water, food, or our ecosystems, then our survival as humans is threatened, and the survival of our species and of our civilization is threatened. And we have reached that point very quickly. We've destroyed over 70% of all the vertebrate animals on the planet since 1970. I was 8 years old. So 7 out of 10 animals have disappeared. We've created monocultures. 72% of all birds on the planet are now farmed poultry. We've destroyed land for land use. We now graze cattle on a land surface area the size of the whole of the continent of Africa. We have run out of land and water for the things that we need and want. So we're now chopping down rainforests. We are destroying ecosystems and environments in which animals can live, now giving us up to 8 species an hour becoming extinct, the biggest mass extinction this planet has ever seen. And on top of these sorts of impacts, we might add pollution, whether it be plastics or chemicals, and we might also add the impacts of climate change, which are now very, very grave indeed. We've added around 2.8 billion Hiroshima bombs worth of energy to our atmosphere since 1995. We've added multiple times that to the oceans, because the oceans absorb 90% of the energy we're trapping. We're currently adding 5 Hiroshima bombs of energy a second to our atmosphere, and that's driving ever-rising temperatures, increasing ice melt from land, thermal expansion of oceans as well, leading to sea level rise. And if you add energy to an atmosphere, you get weather. So we're getting more and more extreme weather events, all of which are more and more extreme. We've seen the fires in California and Canada and Indonesia, the floods in Germany, in England, in China, just this year, for instance. And we've now tipped into positive feedback loops. So the rainforest now emitting carbon rather than drawing it down. We're now melting ice so quickly that it's reflecting less heat back. So energy gain doubled in only the last 14 years. The fires themselves are contributing colossal amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The Eastern Australian fires a year ago added 750 million tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We've got methane hydrates melting, carbonate rocks releasing methane. And we've got tundral warming creating methane, which is 87 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide in its first 20 years. And there are multiple other positive feedback loops. So we are now really, without immediate action to stop emitting greenhouse gases and drawing down carbon dioxide very, very quickly, we're in the last few decades of civilization as we know it now. So that's a short précis of the gravity of the situation we face.
What did you think about the recent meetings where different countries all over the world, global developed countries, pledged to bring down some of those emissions? How do you see the impact of that?
Well, they haven't actually pledged to do that. And the negotiations now, these are the COP, or the Conference of the Parties negotiations. This year is the 26th such negotiation. And they have failed to deliver any change at all in greenhouse gas emissions in the whole of that time. So the so-called Paris Agreement in 2015 made not a dent on the increase in emissions. Even with the 5.8% reduction in emissions from the worldwide lockdown with COVID, we've bounced back again this year to even higher emissions than there were before. And there won't be a meaningful deal to bring down carbon dioxide from the COP negotiations, I don't think. There's never been one before, and I don't think it will happen this time. And that's partly because everyone's got an excuse for why they want to continue. And lots of countries, and we do need a binding deal across all countries, a lot of countries don't want a deal. Russia is dependent for its economy on oil and gas. Many other countries dependent for chopping down trees. We've got many others dependent on coal, on tar sands, on oil, for instance, in the Arab states. None of them want a deal. It's very short-sighted because they'll make some more money for another decade or two, and then it will be over for human civilization. But no one is prepared to jump and lead first. It's the problem we face, sad to say.
I do want to connect this environment conditions to what our viewers, our listeners, and in the topics that we talk about, specifically addressing chronic illness, including diabetes. Can you help us understand the implications there?
It's very interesting, in fact, because in a very brief sentence, what's good for the body also by chance happens to be really, really good for the planet. And what's harmful for our planet turns out to be very, very harmful for us. So let's think about transport. If we take exercise, that's good for us. It increases glucose transporters in our muscle, which means we get better glucose uptake into muscle, improves our glycemic control. We burn the calories we eat, so we don't become fat, which means we don't become diabetic. With all of the plethora of complications that brings with it, we improve our cardiovascular health and so forth. We get less coronary disease, less peripheral vascular disease, less stroke, improved cardiac function, improved lung function, less dementia, less cancer. less obesity, diabetes, osteoarthritis, muscle weakness, and so forth. So exercise is really good for us. If we, though, say, well, we're not going to burn those calories by active movement, we're going to burn oil instead in our cars, or coal in a power station to provide electricity for an electric car. We're using fossil fuel energy, and we're not using our own, which, if it comes from food, and we can talk about that in a minute, which can be healthy food, is very sustainable indeed. So instead, we drive a car that releases carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. It releases multiple pollutants. It produces road dust and brake disc wear and tire wear. Inhaling those products is bad for us. It is linked with dementia now, but it's also linked with cancer and with respiratory disease, indeed asthma. It can kill people indeed with asthma, these particulate pollutants. So it's terribly harmful for us to be doing those things. And actually the alternative is active exercise, which is really, really good for us. None of the bad things happen, and the planet is better off too. If we then think about our diet, people often say, well, how do I lower my carbon footprint? Well, the first thing actually is to consume and buy and use less. Rather than trying to be more efficient in what one does, if you just buy 50% less stuff, your carbon footprint is reduced by 50% straight away. And we all, me included, overconsume, and that includes food. So if we eat more sensibly in terms of the amount we eat, that reduces the carbon footprint, better for the planet, better for our obesity, better for our health. Let's look at the food we eat too. Highly energy intensive processed food production, again, has a massive carbon footprint, but it's also very toxic for us. You are an educated individual in this sphere, and your listeners will be too. You'll know the dangers of processed food. You'll know that corn syrup, fructose, and so forth are particularly bad for reasons we're now understanding. They affect the gut absorptive area. They affect gut leak. They affect liver function detrimentally, and so forth. We know that red meat is bad for us from ruminants because it's associated with cancer and a bunch of other things too, and the animal fats likewise. We know that many of these other high carbohydrate diets and so forth are bad. Meanwhile, the ruminant cattle, are belching methane. As I say, 87 times as powerful as greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide in the first 20 years. So if we move away from ruminant meats, rainforests aren't being chopped down to graze the cattle. Rainforests aren't being chopped down to grow the soya to feed the cattle. There aren't so many cattle belching methane out, and we have a lower risk of cancer and other diseases. So if we then say, well, that's the avoidance, what do we have instead? Well, it's quite simple, isn't it? We know that if we eat a diet that is largely based on vegetables and some nuts and seeds with a bit of fruit, we are healthier, leaner, our metabolic function is better, our physical performance is better, our brains work better. But local seasonable vegetable products are also very low carbon. If they're seasonal, it means they're not being stored in refrigerators, which is a big problem. If they're local, it means they're not being flown around the world or shipped around the world. So the carbon footprint of locally produced seasonal vegetables is good for our planet as well. So it doesn't really much matter which way you come at the problem. And rather peculiarly, I eat very, very little red meat now. I never buy it. If someone serves it to me, if I'm at a dinner party, I'm not rude. I'll eat it and I enjoy it, but I don't buy it anymore. And I did that for climate change reasons. And it was only several years into it that I thought, oh, this is quite interesting. I've just lowered my risk of bowel cancer, amongst other things. And it's odd. You'd have thought of a doctor, I would have done it the other way around, wouldn't you? But I didn't. So there are lots of reasons for the planet and for ourselves to eat the sorts of healthy diets that I'm sure you advocate.
Can you help us understand and just elaborate a bit more about the importance of agriculture and food production patterns, specifically, again, looking at diabetes and chronic conditions?
Yes, well, again, it relates to the amount of food we consume and the sorts of foods we consume. So energy-intensive foods production is very bad for our planet. So every time you till soil, mechanically, 1% of the topsoil blows away. So if you till the soil twice a year, you're only going to have 50 years of topsoil, and then you've run out. We're consuming 4,000 cubic kilometers of water a year, as humans, and there isn't enough of that. So we're having to drain groundwater and fossil aquifers, which are going to run out as well. And we're now having to expand areas we're using, like chopping down rainforests. So we need to consume less, and our agriculture needs to be less intensive as well. And again, the link is how are you growing the food? Where are you growing it, which you need to have locally, but also what are you growing? If you're growing vegetable products, you are drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And when you eat those vegetable products, you'll burn some of that carbohydrate that's in them and release that carbon dioxide again and breathe it out. But that's fine, because that's an entirely sustainable cycle. But those diets we know are that are rich in vegetable products are far less obesogenic. If we move to largely vegetable-based products, as I'm sure you and your listeners will all know, I mean, you can eat a colossal amount of fresh vegetables really without putting on a great deal of weight. And I suppose my clearest example of that for myself was that back in the days when I used to take flights, I was asked to go and do some filming in Japan for a TV series. And I'd also gone out to China on a separate occasion, oddly enough, for work. And on both occasions, I was the honoured guest, which meant that I was fed vast amounts of food for breakfast, lunch, and supper. And I looked at this and thought, I don't normally eat anywhere near this amount of food. But I came back many pounds lighter. And I was surprised until I thought what I was eating. And I was eating virtually no carbohydrate. It's a bit of a myth that a Chinese diet is huge mountains of fried rice or whatever. It really isn't. At the end of a meal, you might get one scoop of rice to mop up the juice in the bowl. But otherwise, it's pretty much entirely vegetables, mushrooms, maybe a little bit of protein like chicken or a bit of fish. But it's predominantly a vegetable-based diet. And in Japan, very much the same. Absolutely delicious vegetable-based products, mostly vegetable, with a little bit of protein and a small amount of rice. I suppose it's worth commenting on it that I suppose for people who don't have a largely vegetable-based diet, it sounds dreadful, doesn't it? It sounds like eating cardboard all day. And how many salads can you eat in your life before you just want to throw the salad bowl out the window? The thing that transformed my engagement in it was a book I'd commend to you. It's called Eat and Run by an American school called Scott Jurek, who was the world ultramarathon champion. So this means he was running races of well over 100 miles. And he had a girlfriend who was a vegetarian. So he tried to conform a little bit with what she was doing. And he noticed that he was running faster. So he increasingly started modifying his diet and found that as he did, he got faster and faster and quicker and quicker and better, until he ended up actually winning the World Ultra Series as a raw vegan. But the book is interesting because he makes the point that if you're burning that many calories and you want to be an elite athlete, you've got to have all the right nutrients in there, the right free fatty acids, the right amino acids. But you've also got to have enough calories. And you've also got something really, really tasty that you're really looking forward to when you're eating your meals, something that you're really going, wow, that's going to taste great. So the book is full of recipes and ingredients I'd never heard of. Shelled hemp seeds, yeast flakes, various sorts of soy product. And I bought them, and they're fantastic. Yeast flakes, for instance, taste like grilled cheese, your favorite grilled cheese. They're just delicious. So if you want to add that sort of really nice sort of to your dishes, you can chuck that in. And the fermented soy products, again, are really, they give you that sort of meaty flavor that you sometimes crave. So that really made a difference to me. I strongly commend it. It made a big difference to my ability to switch from the less healthy diet I used to eat to one that's much more planetary sensible. And of course, it's now much easier too, isn't it? If you go out for dinner, it's easy to get a vegan or vegetarian dish that's delicious. It's really easy to buy oat milk now, isn't it? Instead of cow's milk. Again, it might frighten you to know, here's my coffee cup, that if I make an instant cup of coffee and you think of the carbon cost of all the hot water, the pumping of the water, the chlorination, the filling the kettle, the electricity to boil the water, the beans that are transported, ground up, solute extracted, turned into instant coffee, put in a glass jar for melting sand with a plastic lid on, shipped to my grocery store, and I make the coffee. The carbon cost of the splash of milk is greater than all of that in the coffee cup. Because the cows belch methane, You've got to use electricity to pump the milk. You've then got to flash heat it to 72 degrees and then flash cool it, because that's pasteurization. And then for the rest of its life, it's refrigerated. So again, a nice, easy switch that's healthy, switching to, in my case, oat milk. I know there are lots of other choices. It takes, I think you have to change a pallet. It took a couple of weeks, but now I'm very happy with it. My fridge is stocked there. So again, we don't have to beat ourselves up. Being healthy doesn't have to be painful and horrible.
Diabetes or even chronic disease at large and climate change seem to have both, major global risk, but then are rarely analyzed or considered together, right?
Right.
Why is it so important we treat climate change as perhaps a medical and public health crisis and really combat climate change and these chronic illnesses through integrated policies?
You are so right. You are absolutely right. And the reason it doesn't happen, I'm sure it's the same in North America, it's certainly true of Britain, is that each element of policy is siloed within our government. So we have energy, we have transport, we have education, we have health, we have agriculture, and they're all fighting each other for a share of one budget. And the Treasury trades them all off against each other. No one is stitching the things together in the round. So let's take America and Britain and consider what might happen if you were to take an integrated policy. So let's suppose we said, we want economic growth, we want a healthy, lean, happy, disease-free population, and we don't want climate change. The sets of policies are the same. If we move to renewable energy, so let's suppose America and Britain go straight over to 100% renewables, geopolitically, we're now secure, and our defense of our nations is secure. We're no longer dependent on nations that we might not want to deal with. We're no longer over an oil barrel or a gas pipeline for people that can threaten us or cut off our fuel supplies. We've got military security. We've got energy security. You've then got, if you change the transport policies, you're less dependent on that energy as well. So your infrastructure cost goes down. If you're driving fewer cars, you're not having to maintain the roads to the same sort of extent as well. So transport gets better, air quality improves, noise in neighborhoods falls, asthma rates fall. As we move into those healthy diets, our agriculture becomes secure as well. And we also, of course, get all the other benefits from the exercise. So healthcare costs fall because somewhere down the line, someone has to pay when you're ill. In Britain, we all pay. And so we have a free health system, which is, I have to say, absolutely fantastic. I work in it and it's brilliant. We're top in the world for 9 out of 10 metrics on health as a health service. But if I look at most of my patients on an intensive care unit, I would say 14 out of 15 would disappear if we took action on those measures about which I've been speaking. So if we dealt with alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, poverty, air quality, transport, obesity, and so forth, most of those patients would disappear. Huge savings in terms of healthcare costs, massive benefits to the economy. People are no longer consuming money to prop up their diseases. They're able to continue working, which is good for their families. They've got an income. They're able to pay their taxes. That's good for all of us. So actually, these sorts of policies should be integrated. You're absolutely right. They shouldn't be separated out. And it needs a visionary government somewhere to start saying, well, let's join these things up and create that sort of almost utopian vision of a world where the planet is sustainable, we aren't destroying our ecosystems, and that we have military, energy, fiscal, and health security. And it's all perfectly possible to do now. So spot on. Yeah. We'll have to make you Prime Minister.
No. Until then. Last question for you, Dr. Montgomery. What are things that our listeners can do today? So you talked about a few things that can be done almost immediately to reduce footprint. Any other action items for us listening here today to understand this is what I can do to reduce my footprint and that will lead me to better health?
Great. So there are a few things. The first, of course, is go online if you want to, if you've got a computer and an internet. I suppose most people listening to this must have, and find a carbon calculator. There's a very good one I use. You can register it for which country you're in, US or UK, and it takes about 20 minutes. And you can work out what your carbon footprint is and where the big ticket items are that you can address. So now, if you're rich and you're flying, that's an obvious one. You can say, well, if I cut those things out, that's tons of carbon saved. If you look at your heating bill, for instance, and it's crazy high, you might say, well, if I stick a jumper on, for every degree I lower my heating, I save 7 to 11% of my energy costs. And that's a lot of money saved. It's also a lot of carbon. So it will point out where you can take action most readily. If you've got access to a 100% renewable electricity supplier, in Britain that's very easy. We've got many of them. I'm with a company called Good Energy. There's another called Ecotricity over here. There may well be that your listeners in whichever state or city they're in have got access. Just switch over. It may be marginally more expensive. Mine isn't. But that's something you can readily do. Then when you've got your lights on or your freezer or your TV, you're not polluting the planet. So that's a quick and easy one to do. Moving the food over, the methane issue is true. And I know some people will be listening to this who love their red meat. Well, I'm not going to say go cold turkey straight away, although if you can, do. But otherwise, cut down on the amount of ruminant meat you're eating. Try to move your diet through and look when you're going into shops and think, I wonder what the carbon footprint of that is. And if you can find a local seasonable set of vegetables, start buying that, because you're supporting your local community and your local farmers. Those in your state, for instance, will be very grateful for the products choices that you're making. So I think those are key. Think about your transport. So first thing is, in order, choose to walk or cycle if you can. If you can't walk or cycle, use public transport, because mass transport is better, more energy efficient. If you can't use mass transport and you have to use a car share. Try to marry up your visits to supermarkets or whatever with other people at the same time and put 4 of you in the car, not one. And try not to take air transport if at all possible. So the transport issues are there. And then I suppose the other bit, of course, is governments, as I say, I don't think are going to solve this problem. And businesses are hampered unless we steer them. So that's a rather positive message to end on, isn't it? That actually, if we're going to save ourselves and our planet, it's down to us. And if we all do this together, so talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors, bring them along with it too. And if you make it clear to your whether you're Republican or Democrat or any other way, if you make it clear to them that you're voting on this issue and it's very important, and if you vote with your money, so you start purchasing the low carbon things, and actually, drop a line to your supermarket and say, by the way, this is what I'm doing. I don't approve of these things anymore and I'm moving. Then the market will change too. So the power to change is in our hands if we all join together. And specifically on the diet and otherwise, we will all be healthier and happier too as a result of it. We'll be leaner, fitter, and happier and healthier, as well as our planet will thank us for it as well. So,
win-win all around. Win-win all around. I did lie, so I do have one last question for you, Dr. Montgomery. How can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work after this podcast?
Well, I guess I'm pretty much all over the place online. So I'm Hugh Montgomery. If you put that in and UCL, you'll find there's stuff there. There are publications. We publish the Lancet Countdown, and that's freely available online. You may have to register with the Lancet, but you can read that if you like. It addresses each year where we are with climate change, where we are with energy use, where we are with technology, where we are with finance and policy. It's every year is getting more and more doomsday, I have to say. But if you want a précis, you could just read the executive summaries of the Lancet Countdown on health and climate change. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to see what we're up to, at least in those spheres. It's a reasonable digest, I think. Thank
you so very much for your time, Dr. Montgomery. It was an absolute pleasure.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there, head over to our social media after this episode and answer this question. How has your environment altered your diet in the way you eat? And now that you know better, help us also help tell us about your carbon footprint. So head over to our social media. Let us know what you think there. Thank you again so much for your time, Dr. Montgomery.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Yumlish podcast. Make sure to follow us on social media at Yumlish _ on Instagram and Twitter, and at Yumlish on Facebook and LinkedIn for tips about managing your diabetes and other chronic conditions, and to chat and connect with us about your journey and perspective. You can also visit our website, yumlish.com, for more recipes, advice, and to get involved with all of the exciting opportunities Yumlish has to offer. If you like this week's show, make sure to subscribe so you can hear more from us every time we post. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Remember, your health always comes first. Stay well.